Swinburne has suggested that we should be more cautious about pre-trade transparency. Is it for the
But it's very much along Theory's line here that it's asset class by asset class. And I think, when it comes to equities, there are some very sensible reasons why you'd want to refine the waivers on pre-trade transparency so that ESMA can make sure they're being applied in the same way across all 27 markets. Certainly, they haven't been to date applied consistently across in the equity space, across all marketplaces. So that gives us a much more level playing field, and I think in the equity space that is to be welcomed. When it comes to non-equities, I think there is a real big issue that in many member states we're starting with a very blank sheet of paper because there are no rules set for certain markets at this point. And we have to make sure that we do differentiate based on liquidity. As we've just talked, if a corporate bond is only trading once or twice a month, then there are very different criteria that you would need to apply to it. But the wholesale markets are also very different to retail bond markets, and we need to be very careful that if we're actually talking about the wholesale markets, which when I talk to people in London, they typically think only of the wholesale markets. Whereas if I talk to my Italian colleagues, they of course have got a very thriving retail bond market. And I understand last year the Italian bond market, retail bond market, raised 716 billion euros. So it's a significant market for them. And so, we can't just have this one size fits all when it comes to transparency. I think there are some strong arguments to be made that even in the bond markets, if you're looking at retail-sized orders, there is probably a call that the markets can withstand pre-trade pricing, that they can actually have transparency at that level of order size. Once we get to the wholesale markets, I suspect they can't. And so it's what we do with the space in between retail and wholesale and that intermediary space, whether or not they have any form of pre-trade disclosure or not. And I think we can calibrate, depending on asset class, as to whether or not that needs to happen.
But I think what I find difficult is who decides that.
I think you find there are quite a large number of amendments gone in from the Parliament, which will actually try and distinguish based on different criteria, whether it be liquidity, size of orders, volume, all sorts of parameters will go in. And I think in level one, we will try in the Parliament to have a definition of what ESMA needs to look at in order to actually come up with a definition for what needs pre-trade versus no pre-trade disclosure. And so I think it's likely to be that Parliament will opt in favour of ESMA making the decision, but at level one, the parameters they have to use to decide that will already be defined. So there will be no political decision on their part. It will be predefined in level one for them. But whether or not it's done on size, retail versus wholesale, or whether there's some more sophisticated measures, those debates are yet to be had in the Parliament. We'll start those debates next week, I understand, so it's going to be an interesting dialogue. On post-trade, I think things are very, very different. I think post-trade, even in wholesale size, could, if we had disclosure on a relatively rapid basis, actually be a proxy almost for the lack of pre-trade transparency. So if within a 15-minute window you had 80% of those trades reported, you would have a very good feel in the bond market for what the pricing mechanisms are and where the prices currently are at. And I think it could be a very good proxy. And when people tell me, well, it could have a bad impact on liquidity, and you have to look at things like the TRACE instrument in the US. Now that TRACE has been introduced, it seems it's a limited number of instruments, but it seems to be having a positive effect on liquidity rather than the reverse that was anticipated. So I think we can learn from other jurisdictions on getting that right. And I'm firmly of the opinion that I would prefer to have information in the market rapidly about a large trade taking place, even if we have to mask the volume size of that order. So masking, I have no problem with, so long as then there is a declaration that a trade has taken place, because then people are at least aware that there is something in the market that has happened that they should be aware of. So I think we can find a post-trade regime. And I understand, I know AFME did come to talk to you last week. They have got a proposal on the table for where they try to calibrate this post-trade regime. And I certainly am convinced that there's a lot of merit in the proposals they're putting forwards. And I hope that Brussels can be convinced that now that the industry has come together to produce a back-tested set of data that we can actually at least start to use that as the basis for future discussions.
If I may add one thing on post-trade. The impact on liquidity is one thing, and we could discuss it for a long time. But the quality of price formation is certainly as important as the liquidity argument. If we don't have post-trade transparency, the market lacks vital information. If it lacks vital information, what's the purpose of the market?
But I think Dr. Swinburne has also stated that the quality of data, or data quality, needs to be improved. I mean, do you...
Across the board. When I started to write my report for the Parliament back in April 2010, there was a really distinct lack of data on the equity space, let alone on the fixed income space. And there's been a dispute as to what volume of trades take place in the OTC world and in the dark as opposed to the lit space. And the range of data goes from 13% all the way through to 40%. And the fact that nobody can tell me whether it's 13 or 40% is shocking. And that's all because of the quality of data that's out there. And MiFID 1 obviously fragmented the market, which in terms of competition for me is a positive result. But it allowed people to report those trades to any venue. So you could have your own website and report it on your own website. It didn't have to go to an official source. And so that, I believe, has had a very detrimental effect on data quality and being able to collate the data. And certainly colleagues around the world find it fairly unusual that we don't have a consolidated tape in Europe for our trading records. So I think we are at the stage where we do need to remedy that, particularly in the equity space right now. We need to put measures in. And the Commission's proposals about creating the APA's approved publication arrangements are actually a step in the right direction. It's a competitive situation. It's not a single utility model consolidated tape. However, it is actually finally getting the data to approved providers, and it will then actually have consolidated tape providers pooling that information together. And certainly I've submitted a further amendment within the Parliament to actually suggest that all consolidated tape providers have to go to all approved providers in order to actually consolidate the information, because if they only go to 2 or 3, you still don't have a consolidated tape. You only have a partially consolidated tape. So I think you have to actually give them a nudge in the right direction. There are some huge vested interests in the data world, and there's a huge amount of revenue being made by a large number of people for selling the data. And so I think we do need to have a legislative nudge in the right direction. They haven't come anywhere close to getting a market solution in the last 3 years. On the fixed income space, we're starting afresh, and I think we can actually set some parameters now for what data reporting needs to happen. And I think to miss that piece of the jigsaw would be a serious flaw in the work that's being done. At this point in time, it took AFME 2 years to produce what was average trade volumes per different product. So each bank could produce it for me, each dealer could produce it, but they couldn't collate that information because nobody had ever collated it. So they have now done that, but I would like to see a tape of record, that there was a source that you could go to know what products were outstanding. I think in this day and age that would be a very significant step forwards for investors to be able to know.
That was excellent.